Look, Piers, there's no question that any time a country fights a war of attrition like we see in Ukraine today, that those countries are going to have trouble raising troops. You want to remember when Britain went into World War I in 1914, they had an all-volunteer military. But by 1916, they had to go to a draft. Why did they have to go to a draft? Because there were not enough people who were volunteering. What the Russians are doing is going to great lengths to raise the manpower by providing all sorts of enticements to people in different places in Russia. This is just the way wars are fought. There's no evidence that the Russians are not producing enough of their own troops to fight the war. All the evidence is to the contrary. They are having much success at raising Russian troops and getting them to fight in Ukraine. But my point to you is, if you can get additional troops from another country like North Korea, you would be foolish in the extreme not to take those troops. It just makes common sense. So I think the fact that the Russians are relying to some small, and I choose my words carefully here, small extent on North Korean troops matters for little. The Russians are doing quite well on the battlefield. It's the Ukrainians who, by almost all accounts, are in truly deep trouble.
Well, that trouble could be compounded by the fact the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has announced he would pause foreign aid grants for 90 days. President Zelensky clarified that military aid has not been stopped, but it's unclear whether humanitarian aid has been pulled. And the Ukraine relies on the US for 40% of its military needs, as we know. We don't know how this ends, but if you were a betting man, I don't know if you are, you can tell me if you are. If you were a betting man, in 6 months to a year, where do you think we're going to be with the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I would bet, and I'm not certain of this, I'm just telling you what my best guess is, that a year from now you will have a frozen conflict, that Ukraine will be a dysfunctional rump state, and the West will still be talking in more guarded ways about bringing Ukraine into NATO, and the Russians will have taken somewhere between 30 and 40% of Ukrainian territory and will be in the process of annexing all of that into a greater Russia. I think this is a total disaster for Ukraine, and I think it was remarkably foolish of us to not shut this war down a long time ago and minimize the amount of territory that the Ukrainians lost. But that ship has sailed, and I think at this point in time, it just looks worse and worse for the Ukrainians and for the West as well, because this is going to be a devastating defeat for NATO.
If it ends the way you think it's going to end, many people think, well, if he's got his blood up and he's got a victory in Ukraine, then Putin won't stop there. He's got much bigger ambitions to go and invade other countries and take more territory. Do you think that's a possibility?
Not at all. He's never indicated that he was interested in doing that, and he would be foolish in the extreme to try to do that. I believe he will not take all of Ukraine, in large part because he understands that roughly the western two-thirds of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate the Russians. And if he tried to conquer, occupy, and integrate that part of Ukraine into a greater Russia, he would run into fierce resistance from the ethnic Ukrainians. And the same thing is true if he invaded, a country in the Baltics or Poland or Romania. Putin is fully aware that, occupying other countries is a prescription for disaster in the age of nationalism. You want to remember that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe, and they had to put down an insurrection in East Germany in 1953. They had to invade Hungary in 56. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 68. They almost had to invade Poland 3 times, except for the fact that the Polish Communist Party put down the trouble. And furthermore, they had huge amounts of trouble with countries like Yugoslavia, Albania, and Romania. The Soviets were up to their eyeballs in alligators in Eastern Europe because it's very difficult in the modern world to occupy other countries. You invariably run into resistance. And I think that Putin fully understands this, and he does not want to invade Eastern Europe and certainly Western Europe. And moreover, he does not have the capability. Look at how the Russians have struggled to conquer the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. Just think about it. The Russians have struggled to conquer the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. Does this look like the Wehrmacht in World War II? Does this look like an army that's going to roll over Ukraine, then roll over Eastern Europe and threaten Germany or France or maybe even Britain? I don't think so.